Welcome to a webinar on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership and GMOs. This webinar is co-hosted by the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, IATP, and the Agriculture and Rural Convention, ARC 2020. ARC 2020 is a European network of organizations promoting sustainable agriculture. IATP is a U.S.-based NGO promoting similar goals to promote fair and sustainable food, farm, and trade systems. The TTIP negotiations began just about exactly a year ago. Since the beginning, civil society organizations have focused their efforts around three sets of issues. First, for greater transparency in negotiations. We've advocated for publication of negotiating text and other information so we can know exactly what's being negotiated. Second, against investor-state dispute settlement. This is a provision in trade agreements that allows companies to sue governments over public interest laws that undermine their expected profits. Many of us have also focused on the issue of regulatory coherence, which is bringing standards in the U.S. and EU to similar levels. People on both sides of the Atlantic are working to build fair and sustainable food systems. Part of that effort has been to restrict the use of GMOs or to label GMOs. We're very concerned, based on statements by U.S. agribusinesses, as well as Secretary Vilsack, that these efforts would be undermined by TTIP. Today, we have three amazing speakers. We begin with Linda Schimpf, who is a food campaigner at Friends of Europe. She has a degree in agronomy and has worked with numerous European food, trade, and environmental organizations. Then we'll have two speakers from the U.S.-based Center for Food Safety. Debbie Barker is the International Director at CFS. She was formerly the Director of the International Forum of Globalization, a think tank that analyzes and critiques forms of economic globalization. She'll be followed by J.D. Hansen, who works as a Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Food Safety on issues related to nanotechnology, animal cloning, and animal genetic engineering. That will be followed by a question and answer session, but you can ask your questions at any point during the webinar. Simply type them into the text function, the text box on the right side of your screen. So we'll have presentations for about half an hour and then open up for questions. So first we'll have Linda.
Hello, and thanks for the opportunity to give a presentation on behalf of Friends of Europe and how we see the concerns around TTIP in regards to genetically modified crops in regards to the market and also in regards to the policy framework of it. We are following these discussions and the negotiations on various areas, but we are especially concerned about the impact for food policy and for food markets. Food is a very sensitive issue for citizens in the US as well as in the European Union, and preferences, food cultures have developed over years and decades. And in the context of food policy, GMOs are one of the most controversial issues. And the fact that these negotiations are happening behind closed doors and the public has no access to the actual negotiation text is one of our strong concerns. And the idea of achieving this so-called this crops, this growth and jobs and foster the economic growth is based on the regular coherence, and due to the fact that we have a very different approach in the US and in the EU, how we see GMOs and the relevance of them, we are heavily concerned about the impact that this could have on the European Union. So I start with a short introduction how we see the situation in Europe. There's a very limited role and relevance of GM food. If you go to a European supermarket, you can hardly find any food that contains GMO raw materials. And for more than a decade, it's obligatory in the whole European Union that all food and all feed that contains GM raw material must be labeled. We have one gap in our labeling system, and this is for animal products. So animals which are fed with GM feed, their products as milk, meat, and dairy is not obligatory labeled. We only have voluntary labeling schemes in several European countries. And if you go for the relevance for the European farmers, you can see there's a very limited interest. At the moment, less than 0.1% of the European fields are cultivated with GM crops, and around 90% of this cultivation is happening in one country, and this is in Spain. And only one GM crop can be authorized. It's an old maize from the GM company Monsanto. In addition, 9 governments in Europe have banned the cultivation of GM crops in their country. And there's a rather technical rule, but important for the trade negotiation, is the European Union is applying the general rule that a GMO which is not authorized must not be marketed, even not if it's in a minor trace. So how could it happen that the situation in the US is in the EU is so different from the US situation? First of all, there for decades is a very strong movement for GMO-free fields and plates, and we have clear consumer rejection about GM food, and this is slightly increasing in the last years. And then the laws framing the GMO policy are based on the precautionary principle, and are based on the principle that consumers have a right to choose. And we have in different institutions, in national parliaments, in national governments, but also in the European Parliament, we have a lot of politicians who believe in the need and in the benefits to maintain Europe as GMO-free as possible. And as mentioned before, there's also a lack of convincing GMO products for the European farmers. And this resulted in decisions of 2 transnational biotech companies, as Monsanto and BASF. They announced that they withdraw from developing products from the European market, and they also withdraw several pending applications in recent years. So to give you a picture how GMO-free Europe is, this is the map. There you can see countries that never cultivated GM crops, and also the countries that already actually have banned the cultivation of GM crops. Okay, and what might be changed via the TTIP negotiation is, from the beginning, EU officials have underlined that they would not plan to change the GM laws for Europe. If you check and listen to US diplomats, it's very clear that better market access for GM crops is one of their aims for the agriculture sector. So you can look on the different documents published by the USTR, and it's very clear that they want to see a change, and they identify and declare that the European rules for GMOs are seen as a trade barrier. And if you look on the contributions from various stakeholders of agribusiness, you can also see that they strongly dislike how EU is framing the GM law. For example, even a lobby organization of a wheat producers or lobby organization of a potato producers are identifying trade barriers due to the fact of the European GM laws, even if there's no cultivation of GM potatoes or GM wheat in the US. So what is at risk for European citizens? For us, it's obvious that a trade agreement cannot change basic European laws. But a trade agreement, especially with a focus on regulatory coherence, can have a major impact how these laws are implemented. And implementation means, for example, how you authorize GM crops, and also, for example, the definition of any thresholds. And for any upcoming legislation in GM laws, this could also be heavily impacted by the TTIP outcome. I give you now 3 examples where we see risks and where we don't see risks for the European system. The European GMO labeling rules were entered into force more than a decade ago. And the laws per se cannot be changed by the trade talks. And the laws are based on consumers' choice, and this is also enshrined in the Treaty of the European Union, that consumers have access to good information to take a well-informed choice. So the labeling rules are not based on the assumption that every GM crop would be a risk. But you see in various reports from the USDA demands that any labeling system for products which are not based on a scientific risk should be abandoned and phased out. So this already contradicts. And also you can see various comments from US industry, food industry, that they identify the EU labeling law as a trade barrier for US exporters. So for the general system of the EU labeling rule, we don't see a major risk. But for example, if the EU institution would plan to close the gap for animal products that also meat, eggs, dairy from cows and poultry fed with GM should be labeled, this could be under threat from via TTIP. And it's also the case that the European Commission has just started working on a first framework about voluntary labeling schemes for animal products. And if this would enter into force after the TTIP agreement would be agreed, this could also be affected. And one technical detail is in the EU we have a kind of labeling threshold for 0.9%. Every GMO ingredient above this threshold must be labeled and below under certain conditions. This could also be heavily impacted by the TTIP. And there was some big discussions and some big incidents about the fact that the EU insists only products that are marketed, that are authorized for the European Union can be marketed. This is the general rule for the GMO law with a few exemptions for feed. And for years, EU and US agribusiness is lobbying to get rid of this principle of a GMO law, and they want to have examinations for contamination for GMOs which are not authorized in the European Union. This would mean that farmers or consumers wouldn't get any information that their conventional or organic seed would contain some contamination of GMOs. This would mean farmers could be faced with a situation where they actually cultivate some GM maize or GM rapeseed on their fields without knowing it, or consumers would be faced with a situation that they have GM ingredients on their plates without knowing it about. US diplomats identify the EU policy as a trade barrier, and this is what we see as a very big concern, what could be changed via TTIP, that if there's a joint interest from staff representing the European Commission and want to please US interests and also interest of some feed business in the EU, that the outcome could be that the European Union is abandoning the principle that what is not authorized must not be marketed in the EU. And this would have a strong impact for consumers and farmers, and this would be an attack on one of the core principles of the European law. One other area of GMO policy is how the European Union is organizing the authorization of GM food, feeds and seeds for cultivation. The aims of its legislations are to defend high standards for environmental health, protection, and also defend consumers' interests. The aim of these laws are not to increase transatlantic trade. And in the food safety report from the USDA from this year, you can read that the fact that the European Union insists that you need to register any GM crop for Europe is identified as a trade barrier. And this is from our side really surprisingly that from US diplomats that we are faced with an assessment of a situation that the right to regulate, the right to identify their own standards, how the European Union are authorizing different substances is seen as a trade barrier. And what could be the impact of a TTIP? If the EU is thinking to develop higher standards for safety checks, how GM food, feed and seed can be authorized, we would expect heavy attack from US diplomats and US industry on this. And we also notice for some safety checks, the EU entered into force a technical regulation this year, and this was also raised some concerns or seen from US officials that this is a kind of trade barrier. And due to the fact that we have so different systems, how we assess how GMOs are authorized in the EU and in the US, we don't see any benefits for European citizens and for the European policy aims to have a regulatory coherence between EU GMO policy and US GMO policy. And a big impact for the European public would be that we have strong concerns that more GM crops could be authorized for the European market, and also under standards which are more relaxed than the current one. So our key demands for the TTIP is that we are not willing to accept any compromise that attacks key principles of European law as the polluters pays principle, as the precautionary principle via these negotiations. And therefore we demand that any policy area which is relevant for food safety, for animal or plant health should be excluded from this agreement, because we don't think it's convincing to bargain trade interest via food safety issues, consumer and environmental rights in order to increase the trade between US and EU. And here in the presentation we have an overview about some applications that we launched. One is together with IATP. Thanks.
So this is Debbie Barker from Center for Food Safety. Karen, do you want me to go ahead with this presentation that JD and I have?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So we're starting off really just going through current state of GE crops in the U.S. And our experience here, because the U.S. is by far the largest grower of GE crops. And then I'll turn it over, so I'll review the status of that, and then I'll turn it over to JD to talk about the regulatory regime or lack thereof of GE crops here and foods. And then I'll pick it up again with some of the labeling initiatives and tie it into some of the TTIP aspects that we're concerned about. So as I said, the U.S. grows more GE crops than any other country by quite a wide margin, approximately 169 million acres, and that's half the total agriculture land in the U.S. Grows GE corn, cotton, and soybeans. And you can see the majority of these plants for the GE traits, there are two kinds of traits, basically herbicide-tolerant crops, where the crops withstand doses of herbicides, in this case primarily glyphosate, and then BT crops, which express its own herbicide. But the majority of crops are the herbicide-tolerant crops. You can see 94% of soy, 72% of corn, and 96% of cotton. For the BT, 65% is corn and 75% of cotton. And the chart can show you the adoption of the various crops over time. And one trend that we see, and this is largely in response to the resistance, we have I'll talk more in detail about the quote super weeds that are happening at a rather astonishing rate in the U.S. But one of the responses to that is you're seeing a lot more stacked varieties where there's various traits coming down the pike, and you can see how that's already how it's being adopted in corn and cotton. So as I said, there's a huge problem with the GE crops and the rise of superweeds. Agronomists are really alarmed. It's a growing epidemic. And this is in response to primarily Monsanto's Roundup Ready crops of glyphosate. Glyphosate is the herbicide. And at least 14 glyphosate-resistant weed species have been identified. Some reports show many more. Farm Industry News reported just last year that cropland has been infested with glyphosate-resistant weeds, had expanded to 61.2 million acres. And this was an increase of 51% compared to 2011. And also the Farm News reported that nearly half of all U.S. farmers interviewed reported that they had glyphosate-resistant weeds. And this was in 2012. So this is even gaining since then, all statistics show. And in 2014, very recently, the Texas Department of Agriculture has requested that the EPA, which is our Environmental Protection Agency, approve the emergency use of hundreds of thousands of pounds of a very hazardous herbicide, propazine, to kill the herbicide-resistant weeds that are infesting almost 3 million acres of Texas cotton. And that represents about a quarter of total U.S. cotton production. Propazine is linked to numerous potential and known health threats, and it is banned in the EU. Another issue besides the superweeds is that we've seen increased seed prices go up quite dramatically in the U.S. You can see with the advent of GE crops. 1995 to 2011, soybeans, 325% increase, and this is just the seed. Of course, this doesn't even take into account the cost of the herbicides, which has also been increasing. Corn, 259%, and cotton, 516%. Obviously, that has impacts, significant impacts for our farmers. Increased use of pesticides, more than 26% more pesticides per acre were used on GE crops than on non-GE, just conventional crops. And this is USDA data of 2008. You can see these other stats worldwide. 650,000 tons of glyphosate products were used in 2011. And herbicide-resistant, or HR crops, have increased overall herbicide use by approximately 572 million pounds. Another problem, as Muta mentioned, the farmers in the EU being concerned about contamination. Well, it's happened here in the US repeatedly. I just use a few examples. Well, this one major example really is with GE wheat. As you know, there's no commercial GE wheat approved in the US or anywhere. In 2012, though, 2 years ago, this is nearly 9 years after Monsanto ended the field trials of GE wheat, a farmer in Oregon discovered the presence of GE wheat in his field. Immediately, Japan and other countries that purchase U.S. wheat but do not accept GE products temporarily suspended their imports. This is one of the reasons that the GE wheat was rejected in the first place, why Monsanto backed off in 2012, is because a 2005 study estimated that the industry could lose significant profits. You can see the estimate, 94 to 272 million, because of countries that do not accept GE wheat. And here we have now a year, almost 2 years later, since the GE wheat contamination incident in Oregon, and officials still do not know where the GE wheat came from and how it ended up in the farmer field. Yet in the meantime, the USDA has gone ahead and approved 22 new GE wheat field trials since the contamination incident. Other issues, we have reduced seed options, corporate consolidation and domination. It's increasingly difficult for farmers to even find non-GE, even conventional seeds, let alone organic seeds. Reduced innovation. Scientists and academics are concerned that the seed patenting situation has strangled independent and cooperative research. And we have a loss of seed diversity, and this is, of course, a huge problem worldwide, but in the U.S. we see this in the one example, just to illustrate. The U.S. has lost 6,000 of 7,000 apple varieties, and this is really since the advent of industrial agriculture, not specifically to GE, but as I say, as GE becomes more dominant seed, that even closes the seed diversity more. Our next generation GE crops, as I said, to respond to the glyphosate-resistant weed problem, the response has been to commercialize crops, GE crops, that have more toxic pesticides and herbicides. Dow Chemical has submitted a request to the USDA to commercialize GE corn and soybeans to withstand the toxic pesticide 2,4-D. Enlist is the brand name, and as you probably know, 2,4-D was a component of Agent Orange, which was the defoliant used in the Vietnam War. It's been associated with deadly immune system cancers, Parkinson's disease, endocrine disruption, and reproductive problems. We also, the estimates are that widespread cultivation of 2,4-D resistant soybeans would trigger a substantial increase in the use of this chemical to over 100 million pounds per year, and that's 4 times the current level. The next, another next generation crop is dicamba resistant soybeans. As you can see, epidemiology studies have tentatively linked exposure to dicamba to increased incidence of colon, lung, and immune system cancers. Other studies have showed that exposure exhibited 20% inhibition of an enzyme critical to brain function. So as we note, these are ever more increasing doses. Not only are the farmers using more chemicals, but in response to the resistance issue, the industry, GE industry, is promoting ever more toxic pesticides and herbicides to deal with this problem. Now I'm going to turn this over to JD. He's going to talk a bit about our regulatory system here.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I hope my screen is being seen. The United States, some 30 years ago, when biotech was first beginning, did not do what many other countries did, which is draft new regulations for biotech, but instead tried to fit biotech into existing regulations. And so we have a huge number of agencies and statutes that are one way or the other trying to regulate biotech. So we've got the U.S. Department of Agriculture regulating in the main plants, and we have the Environmental Protection Agency having some role in regulating it all. We have the Food and Drug Administration regulating whether these are safe to eat, and so we have a system that has been called the coordinated framework. In reality, it's pretty non-coordinated, and as new kinds of genetic engineering move on to the market, some of the statutes that they've used to regulate aren't working. The way we used to move genes into plants in particular was to use plant pathogens to do that job. Now, with new techniques, it's no longer being done that way. See if I can move to the next slide. So the Plant Protection Act enacted by Congress in 2000 was an attempt to coordinate federal policy, but as I mentioned, that is moving on. All of the, most all of these crops, because they are engineered to be resistant to particular herbicides, or they're engineered to be to actually contain insecticides, they have to go through EPA review, and that's the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. But for the most part, most of the pesticides are approved much more quickly in the U.S. than in Europe, and the plants are, for the most part, approved very quickly. As said, the main agencies with regulation over GE crops are the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is responsible for approving field trials and then deregulating the crops after the field trials, that is to permit cultivation and commercialization. The EPA again approves use and monitors pesticides, though our standards for pesticide tolerance are not always that strict, and we typically allow conditional registration of pesticides. That is, the pesticide is allowed to be in the market before the company has completed all of the required testing for safety. And the Food and Drug Administration, even though these are brand new, never seen before products, has generally approved them as through a process where the company self-regulates, called generally regarded as safe. As we're moving into GE animals, such as the genetically engineered salmon, the FDA, rather than using a stronger food additive standard that would actually require testing of humans and animals eating this new genetically engineered fish, has decided that all they're doing is approving a genetically engineered construct as a new drug for the fish. And the FDA is also responsible for labeling, and has been very resistant to label GE crops. And so we have no GE crops labeled in the United States by the FDA. This is data from the European Association for Bioindustries that...
this is Karen. I'm giving you a 2-minute warning, okay?
Okay. It shows that while Europe takes longer to approve products, it nonetheless does approve products that are genetically engineered. So basically, what happens in the United States, most of the crops go through the APHIS USDA process. They're approved rather quickly in the U.S. and I'll move on to the next. Basically, a corporation petitions APHIS after conducting field trials to allow that the crop can go to market. And our organization, it should be noted, has sued APHIS a number of times because they haven't done these reviews very well. And we've typically won those lawsuits and made them go back and do it. So in the 15 plus years that APHIS has been approving GE crops, it has relied almost entirely on data provided by the companies, and we don't think it should be done that way. And basically, the USDA doesn't even know all the places that it's approved for GE trials to take place. And I will stop at this point and let Debbie go on and talk about the process of labeling GE products or not labeling them in the U.S.
Okay, so yeah, just quickly then here, moving on to the labeling aspect. As you can see, almost 70, some say 90% of all processed foods in the U.S., soda to soup, sold in the U.S. supermarkets contain genetically modified organisms. But as JD said, the U.S. requires no labeling of these products, and of course industry has been fighting any labeling initiatives that have been happening quite robustly here in the U.S. You can see, and this figure changes daily, it's going up, the number of bills and legislation that various states are putting out there where people want some labeling of their genetically engineered products. We have 3 states now that have passed legislation, and I'll show my screen, okay. Sorry, is this, yeah, okay. Can you all see the screen with the state and the number of bills and the map of the U.S.? Yeah. Okay. So you'll see the states that have been involved right now, the 3 states that have passed labeling initiatives, and of course Center for Food Safety is working a lot on the labeling initiatives, these state labeling initiatives. And next, so the TTIP role in expanding GE crops and eliminating or restricting GE labeling, we think is very real, not only in the EU, as Muta has outlined, but even back here in the US. If labeling issues are restricted under TTIP, that could then go back, affect US initiatives too, where you know, lawmakers could say, or trade officials could say, look, the initiatives in the U.S. for labeling are trade restrictive, and so we know that this could happen based on some other trade cases that have already happened. And also, though, just to, as Muta said, the U.S. industry and officials are really hammering away at the precautionary principle basis for approving GE crops that the EU undertakes, and constantly are saying that it's unscientific, not based on science. A lobbyist for U.S. Council for International Business, who, by the way, used to then also work for Bio, I believe, commented that TTIP is only worth doing if, quote, getting rid of the precautionary principle is achieved. And then the recent submission by the National Confectioners Association comment to the USTR, they urge them to achieve progress in removing mandatory GMO labeling and traceability requirements. So the industry push is very real and very strong. As I said, the history of trade legal challenges impacting food safety in particular, and even, as I mentioned, labeling. The proposed TTIP investor-state dispute settlement could allow corporations to challenge domestic food standards such as labeling. Under WTO dispute system, the U.S. successfully challenged EU policies on delays for approving GE crops and also GE process-based labeling and traceability. And the WTO has also ruled against the U.S. country of origin labeling requirements for meat. So we have 2 very specific cases demonstrating that, in fact, usually trade tribunals or courts will rule in the case for corporate or industry interests and rule against domestic food safety or public health policy. We have our source pages for everything that we footnoted, and there's JD and myself.
All right, thanks, Debbie. We're going to open up for questions now, and I do want to mention right off that the webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending the recording and the slides to everyone who registered for the webinar. So you'll have access to those later. We're going to start with a question that was emailed to us in advance of the webinar from Linda Coucher in the UK. She asks, what are the implications of the recent EU Environmental Council vote, and what is the rest of the process? Linda, I think that one's for you.
Yes. A few weeks ago there was a vote amongst the EU environmental ministers about a new law which is pretending to offer better rights for national governments to ban the cultivation of GM crops. So everybody would expect that we as an environmental organization would welcome this decision. In reality, we are very critical about the outcome of this agreement amongst the environmental ministers in Europe, because what they more or less agreed is that the first time biotech companies would become a formal role in the decision of a national government to ban the cultivation of GM crop. So we fight for the principle, we fight for better rights for national governments to get real rights to ban the cultivation, whilst we reject the outcome of the Council. So the next step is that in autumn the European Parliament will rediscuss this proposal. They had the first vote on it about in summer 2011, and now in autumn they will come up with a second opinion about the outcome of environmental ministers, and then depending on this vote, it either go for a third round with environmental ministers, or we find a compromise between environmental ministers and the parliamentarians.
Okay, great. I have a couple of questions on process that I'm going to combine here, and perhaps you all could say something about. The first is from Eva Schoenfeld, who's asking if it's the case that only new legislation, rather than existing legislation, I guess, could be challenged through TTIP. And then we have two questions from Pablo Saranlegui about the approval process. What is the approval process, and how could the EU Commission pass over the Parliament to sign TTIP? So why don't we start with Muta, and then I think maybe Debbie or JD would have something to say about the process in TTIP as well.
So a question about if it's only relevant for new legislation. In the European Union we have EU-wide laws and rules which are decided in complex procedure involving national governments, involving the European Parliament and the European Commission. And for these basic laws, they cannot be changed via TTIP because a trade agreement cannot overrule the interests of the three EU institutions. But, as I tried to explain before, it can impact heavily how these basic laws are implemented. And to give you another example from the pesticide policy, the European Union has a new pesticide law since 2009. Now we have 2014, and big parts of it still wait for the final rules, how you implement them. And this implementation of a politics, which scientific facts you need to consider for thresholds, who is involved in decisions, who are the real experts, all of this can be impacted by the outcome of a TTIP, because this is done on a lower level of political decisions. But one big threat is for upcoming legislation, because if the TTIP would come to an agreement, if the US and the EU would find a solution for this, then it could be a big threat for a race to the bottom of standards and for environmental, consumers and food policy. About this procedure between the European Commission and the Parliament, the full power lies in the hand of the European Commission. They do the negotiations with the US diplomats. But the final outcome must pass a vote in the European Parliament and also a vote in the Council amongst the European trade ministers. But they can't change the agreement. They only can say we are against it or we are in favor of it, but you need their consent. And an open question is if national parliaments also will be involved in it. If you ask the national governments, they say yes. If you ask the European Commission, they say no.
Debbie, did you want to add something about the process?
Yeah, just to say, so the process is, I mean, we can't definitively answer that question because we actually don't know, because of the non-transparency of these negotiations, what the eventual regulatory process will be. There are two aspects we're concerned about, something called the Regulatory Cooperation Council, which by leaked documents, what we do know is that this is, the proposal thus far is that for all future or new regulation on anything in the EU and the US would have to go through this council first. And of course, we need to know many more details about that, but that could have great impacts for future GE legislation on both sides of the Atlantic. And then, as I mentioned before, the investor-state dispute settlement system. I mean, as I pointed out already in the WTO did side with the U.S. against the EU policies for some of their labeling or traceability. It was in the end a moot point because by the time the case was decided, the EU had already decided their legislation. So the U.S. didn't challenge that again. But they can use these investor dispute courts to basically challenge domestic laws, and depending on the rules of the ISDS within TTIP, they can sometimes overrule national or domestic legislation. And then I think, as Muta was also saying, the chilling effect is really probably this more insidious aspect, because as we know, for example, that as the U.S. is pushing EU very strongly to give up some turf, whether it be on labeling or accepting some form of tolerance levels for GE, in a negotiation, you know, there's give and take, and threats through these regulatory things can have a chilling effect, and even just negotiations can have a chilling effect on legislators' ability to really put in place the strongest, highest standards that they would ideally want to do.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the really big differences is that the U.S. Takes a risk-benefit approach to everything that is required to weigh cost and benefits to businesses, not protection of consumers or the environment as its main thing. That's very different than the way the European Union approves things. And what could happen is the U.S. very much pushing the EU to accept its approvals of any GM crops that may not pass muster in Europe, but because of our more lax approach, get approved here.
Okay, I have a question now from Rachel Smoker. It says the EU is importing large amounts of wood pellets from the U.S. to burn in coal plants as substitutes for coal. The U.S. is on the verge of deregulating GMO eucalyptus, which is specifically intended for bioenergy. What insights can we glean regarding potential and expanding trade in wood from GMO trees?
This is Debbie. Yeah, we at CFS wrote a report last year about genetically engineered trees, which is kind of a new frontier in a way. And yes, as Rachel said, they have submissions for GE eucalyptus, and largely they'll be planted in plantations southeast and the south and shipped to the EU. There are many other trees actually that are also being field tested, GE trees in the US, some pine and different varieties, and this is a big area that the movements in the EU and the US can get together and work on, because while it's not a crop or a food per se, if importing these GE eucalyptus chips will definitely mean that the EU could have a lot of GE wood that it's burning in its power plants.
Okay, I have a comment and a question from Samuel today. The comment is on GM mapping in the EU. It's not about countries who had never cultivated any GM crops, but about EU countries who did not approve both GM Monsanto maize and potato and flora. For instance, France approved some GM maize at the end of the 1990s, but then despite the lack of approval, some unallowed GM maize is being cultivated across the country. So that's something that Muta may want to comment on. But I'd also like to, he also poses a question for JD. Tactically, do you think that U.S. negotiators could put more pressure on EU GM approval systems for imported feedstuff rather than for GM crops, given that EU social and political pressure against imported soy for animal feed is weaker?
JD, do you want to start?
Yeah, I could do that. Well, I mean, already there's GM feed imported into Europe. It's one of the areas that when you look at U.S. EU food exchange, soy is a major area that we're already exporting to Europe, and partly it's because animals that are fed GE food in Europe don't need to be labeled. So I don't think that aspect is likely to change in the agreement. I think there certainly could be more pressure to accept even more U.S. soy or corn for animal feed.
About this question for national bans in different European countries, I think the decision of governments to ban GM crops happened already several years ago, because in past a few more GM crops have been authorized to be cultivated in the European Union, for which either the authorization phased out or the biotech companies withdraw the application. So in the question of national bans is a big topic and a big discussion in the European Union, because very often the European Commission is taking the final decision to authorize the GM crops, whilst a simple majority of the national governments is voting against it. But in most cases, the national governments couldn't stop the European Commission from authorizing more GM crops. So this is one reason why you are demanding better legal solid rights to ban the cultivation, and this is also a sensitive issue. Is the competence to decide about something so controversial in Europe only in the hands of a central European Commission, or should the national governments have a stronger role in it? And for me, it's also, I got the impression that the biotech companies are less interested in the cultivation of GM crops in Europe. They state this also in press releases, especially Monsanto and BASF, and they focus more on the import, especially of GM food. For the European Union, if you look on the lobby documents from the agribusiness, it's also backing this assessment that they get keen to get better market access for imports for food and feed from the US or from other areas as Argentina or Brazil, and less on the actual cultivation of GM crops in Europe, because I think at one point they realize. And if I can, I want to make a short comment about this precautionary principle, because very often you have impression, on one hand you have solid scientific based decisions, on the other hand you have a precautionary principle which is completely unscientific. From our point, if you want to translate precautionary principle in a more regular language, we would say precaution means you take the time and the space to take a well-informed decision in order to reduce, to pay your bill at a later stage. And the precautionary principle is not non-scientific. For us, it's just another approach, how you be aware that maybe your scientific understanding, your scientific methods are lack of a full picture, and therefore you need to take more time and more facts into account before you take your decision. And for us, it's not an either or. For us, science is not versus precaution. For us, science is embedded in the precautionary principle, and it's a question how you interpret and how you read science.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so I'm going to summarize a couple of other questions and then ask each speaker to give us maybe a 30-second wrap-up of their major points or their major concerns around TTIP. Virginia Brown has mentioned the issue of investor-state dispute settlement, that is a major concern in these trade talks, that governments, particularly the EU government, I would say also the US government, could be sued by corporations, as has happened under similar agreements around the world. So there was one more, and Helena Paul is asking, how do speakers assess the impact on the EU and US of TTIP discussions on the apparent position of China on GM crops? And then finally, what I think is a good wrap-up question from Eric Munier, could the effects of TTIP go from the EU to the US? So these are sort of some concluding thoughts. I would ask each speaker then to speak very quickly, because we really are almost out of time, what you would see as a major concluding statement you'd want to make. Say 2 sentences each. Debbie, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, I think probably the overarching thing, as many of us have said, is transparency for these negotiations is of the utmost importance, because all of these things that we're talking about now, we really need to see the negotiating text to know really how to respond. Civil society and negotiators keep telling us, don't worry, food safety won't be compromised, don't worry, don't worry. But as we know from past experience working on trade agreements, specific negotiating text is everything and will determine what goes ahead and what goes forward. And so our overall demand from civil society is that we see the negotiating text after each round.
Okay, JD, quickly.
Well, I would second what Debbie says, and really, I think we need to take food entirely out of these trade negotiations. We've negotiated other things separate from this kind of negotiation. Food really has to be special, and we shouldn't even have it in the agreement. Especially because it's being done in a non-transparent way.
Okay, Luta.
For us, this trade agreement, it's not about US government versus European Union Commission or councils. For us, one of the big threats of this trade agreement that it's giving more powers for corporations in the early drafting stage for new legislation versus the interests of European citizens, but also versus the interests of US citizens. We really follow from European this fight for labeling the right to know in the US, and we are really inspired and we try to support this. Because the question of transparency and of getting information, what you want to have and what is on your plate, what is on your field, what are your researchers doing, is really keen to come up with stricter regulation that protects the environment, that give consumers the right to know, and that also give the highest standards of food safety. And for us, the right to regulate is a higher right and should be the main priority, and not the right to increase the transatlantic trade for this promised minimum growth and jobs. And for us, this is the reason why we say we are very skeptical about this regulatory coherence, and we fully back what the colleagues from the Center for Food Safety said, that we want to have full transparency, we want to have food excluded from these negotiations.
All right, thank you. We really are out of time. I do want to mention, though, that this is the second in a series of webinars on TTIP, agriculture, and food issues. The first webinar was about a month ago on TTIP and chlorinated chicken. That one, as well as this one, are available as recordings. We'll be sending out the recordings of this one within a week. There will be a third webinar on TTIP and antibiotics on July 24th, and we'll be sending out an announcement of that shortly. I want to thank the speakers very much, and also to people in the audience who sent such great questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you all.